This is Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'd like to welcome you to our program. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With me today are two of our regular critical analysts. On my right is Denise Keele. Denise is a professor of political science at Western Michigan University, and she also is affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and chairs the working group on climate change at WMU, plus a few other things that we could have added in there. On my left is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and recently retired from being a city commissioner in the city of Kalamazoo after a long run, 22 years?
22 years.
On the city commission?
Yeah.
Wow, great. So welcome to our program. Happy New Year. This is our first program in 2020. And the critical issue that we want to focus on today is the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian Major General, taken out by a drone strike by the Trump administration. Yeah. And of course that's led to an extreme crisis in the Middle East and the possibility of a war between Iran and the United States. Iran did retaliate this week, and we thought it might escalate beyond that, but their retaliation was somewhat measured, and then the Trump administration sort of walked it back as well. But there's no doubt that we're still in a very dangerous situation. The potential for war between Iran and the United States, a greater war in the Middle East, is still very real. We want to present, of course, an alternative perspective, one that you're not getting from the corporate media, from the mainstream media, one that's diametrically opposed to what the Trump administration is pushing on us. I had to laugh. I saw Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, he was the aide to Colin Powell in the run-up to the Iraq War, and he was being interviewed, and he's a very blunt kind of guy, and he was talking about the Trump rationale for doing this. He's bull. It's just bull.
He said that Cheney and them were, at least they thought about it, but these guys were just laughable when they presented.
So the alternative view that we want to present is going to counter what we have deemed to be the lies and distortions of the Trump administration, the parroting of the administration position by the mainstream media, and even, unfortunately, a number of important Democratic Party members, some of the candidates for the 2020 nomination. I don't think that the Democrats have taken a very strong stand, other than Bernie Sanders. So we might want to try to incorporate that as well. Now, to present this alternative perspective, we have to step back. You have to look at the historical context, and that's one of the most glaring omissions in all of the discussion of this. Nobody talks about the history. There's a lengthy history here to go through, but it's a very important history. And if you don't know that history, you can't understand the current crisis. There are also a number of pretty important legal issues, Denise, constitutional issues. You political scientists like to weigh in on those, on that thing called the Constitution.
Maybe we should, the history should start there at least.
We should certainly look there. And there are a number of other political and economic issues that I think need to be addressed. And I would like, again, to come back and criticize the media coverage of this whole thing. And again, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are things that many Americans don't know about. It's been stripped out of our history. It's not present in the media. And often these are very uncomfortable things because to a large extent, this crisis is something that the United States has caused. If we're talking about a rogue state, it's the United States that has actually been the rogue state. Now, we're not making any excuses for the Iranian regime. In many regards, this theocratic regime in Iran is dangerous in its own right, and we want to rightly criticize them for their human rights violations and their repressive actions in their own country. But when we unpack the history, I think we find that who has blood on their hands, who is the rogue state? It's mostly the United States. Again, those are very uncomfortable truths for a lot of Americans to deal with. But let's dive into that historical context. You can actually go all the way back to World War II, right? I mean, at that point, Franklin Roosevelt, even before the end of the war, met with the Saudi king and said, hey, you've got all that oil and we'd like to have access to it, and we can provide military protection for you. And they actually signed an agreement on a U.S. naval ship off the coast.
Yes.
And so the U.S. involvement in the region goes back at least to that point. We could probably point to earlier antecedents as well. But I think from that point on, we see a very concerted effort on the part of the United States to exercise control over the Middle East, and primarily, again, to control oil coming from the Middle East, our access to and our control over that oil. Now, move forward a few years, 1953. Don, what happened in 1953?
Well, in 1953, that's when the CIA overthrew the president in Iran.
Democratically elected.
Democratically elected president of Iran, and replaced him with a man who became a dictator and a torturer, and with great resentment from the people of Iran. That was a time when CIA was regularly intervening in other countries and overthrew a person who had been elected by the people and chosen by the people.
And was attempting to nationalize Iran's oil.
That's right.
And so it was not just Washington, it was also London. The Brits were involved in this as well. But because of the effort to nationalize the oil in Iran, they couldn't consent. So again, Mossadegh, the president was who elected official, was overthrown. Now, you mentioned the Shah. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was installed at that point, and we see then a very murderous, repressive regime.
Yes.
And again, you can't understand what's happening in Iran today between Iran and the United States unless you understand that the Iranian people still remember this, right?
Sure.
They know that this is the history, right? That we overthrew their democratically elected government, we installed a ruthless dictator who then ruled for a very long period of time. Now, this led eventually to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And again, that resulted in the current regime taking power. At that time, it was Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, we have basically a repressive, theocratic regime that takes over. Now, that's not a good thing. It's never a good thing to have a repressive, theocratic regime controlling your country. I hope we learn that lesson, because there are many people in the United States who believe that we ought to have a theocracy installed here, a Christian theocracy, and that should be fought against very hard. But we did allow, in this point, because of our clumsy interventions, allow for the Islamic Revolution to occur. Now, of course, this involved the takeover of the embassy, the hostage crisis. 52 hostages went on for 444 days. And the other thing I think it's really important to mention in connection with the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Jimmy Carter was the president at that time. And up to that point, we had not had to have U.S. forces intervene militarily in the Middle East, right? We had Israel, we had Iraq, we had the Shah, and so we didn't really have to, we had the Saudis, so we didn't see a need to have to intervene directly. But the Islamic Revolution overturns all of that. And so from this point on, we're very concerned that Iran has now escaped our control, escaped our domination. And so at this point, Jimmy Carter, whose re-election campaign is threatened, comes up with something called the Carter Doctrine. Denise, you remember what the Carter Doctrine said?
Not enough.
Well, it basically just said, that's
ours. So this is, well, you got to remember, this is also during this country's first true energy crisis. Right.
Oh,
so the late 70s, none of this, I think, is by mistake. That Carter, of course, is facing re-election to a guy named Reagan, who you might know, right? And we're facing this energy crisis. Gas prices are through the roof.
Quadrupled in a month.
Exactly right. And so we take that with the idea of American exceptionalism and, oh, who are these folks? I remember one of the signs during that period, Carter was the first election, sorry guys, I was in grade school and we paid attention to, we got to vote in class. One of the signs that someone brought that I didn't understand for probably 20 years later was, why is all of our oil under their sand? And I still remember that in links to how Carter's trying to, and then OPEC is formed, right?
OPEC,
and
Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Right.
Exactly, and so that whole era to me is wrapped up in this idea of what kind of monetary arrangement are we going to at least make to, on the face, settle these disputes that are, in fact, over energy and over oil. So Carter is tied in with OPEC and letting these guys kind of get away, right? Whatever else you want to do, that's okay.
I think that President Carter said that any curtailment of the oil flowing to this country would be considered a direct attack on this country,
right.
and we would respond.
That's right.
Any threat to our vital interests.
Vital interests.
So
yes.
it sets up, right, this next Iraq, it sets up the next, 40 years.
So the Carter Doctrine basically commits the United States, and of course the Rapid Deployment Force was created at this time, which eventually morphs into Central Command, right? So the military's effort to exercise military control on the Middle East comes through Central Command. And a lot of people don't remember that Saddam Hussein took this opportunity to invade Iran and start a war with Iran, and we backed Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
He was our guy
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah.
And there's even that famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld going to Baghdad and shaking Saddam Hussein's hand and pledging support for their effort against who now is our enemy, Iran, right? Ever to the Islamic Revolution,
Right.
Iran is now a target for us, and so we could use Saddam to go after them at that point. There was also the Iran-Contra scandal. We should probably mention that in there, that the Reagan administration was playing footsie with selling missiles to Iran under the table so they could get money to give to the Contras in Central America.
Right.
So that was a huge scandal. A lot of people also don't remember that in 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down a Iranian civilian airliner. Flight 655, 290 people were killed. It was a complete mistake on the part of the U.S. Forces at that point, and so an innocent civilian airliner was shot down. We never really, I think we made some payments, some reparations, but we never really apologized in a forthright way for that. But again, and just the fact that another civilian airliner was shot down.
280 people, right.
Just the other day, in all the aftermath of what was going on, and it's still not exactly clear what happened. It appears from the early evidence that Iran was responsible with a surface-to-air missile for hitting that civilian airliner, the Ukrainian airliner, but we still don't know all the details of what happened with that. But again, once you enter into these tense situations, once you unleash the hounds of war, it opens the door for all kinds of bad things to happen. Now, we also have to mention, of course, after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, which were carried out mostly by Saudis, right? Mostly carried out by Sunni extremists, and the Sunni-Shia divide is a very important part of the story here as well, because Iran's theocratic regime is Shiite, and of course Saddam was a Sunni, and Al-Qaeda was Sunni, and the Saudis are Sunni, and so you know that Sunni-Shiite split in battle has large consequences for what's happening in the Middle East. But after the 9/11 attacks, then the United States decided to illegally invade Afghanistan. It was a violation of international law. The UN Code is very clear that can't be permitted. And then, of course, soon after that, Bush lumped Iran in with Iraq and North Korea as part of the axis of evil, if you remember, in his one of his addresses. And then, of course, what the Bush administration and the neoconservatives and the hardcore nationalists in the Bush administration wanted to do all along was to now take out Saddam, because he had, escaped control and had become a rogue force after the invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, and then that led to the first Gulf War against Iraq in 1991. So now Saddam is also on the enemy's list, and so they wanted to use 9/11 as an excuse to go after Iraq. Inconvenient for them was the fact that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and so, all right, well, we'll go after Afghanistan first, as long as you then promise that we can attack Iraq next. And that was the bargain, and that's a long history that we don't have to get into now. But both the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war are critical here, because here the United States has invaded and exercise control and establish military bases in the countries that are on each side of Iran, right? If If you look at a map, on one side is Afghanistan, on the other side is Iraq, and there are military bases. Somebody put up a picture on Facebook last week which showed all these U.S. military bases, and it's just a complete encirclement of Iran. You know, and somebody said, well, Iran must want war. Look, they put their country near all our military bases, right?
Exactly right.
They must want war. Which is crazy. And again, if Americans would just step back for a moment and think, what if Iran had invaded Canada and had invaded Mexico and had set up a string of military bases on both sides of us? Would we feel threatened? And if there was also a history where Iran had overthrown the democratically elected government of the United States, from which we had finally escaped from that control. But now Iran controlled Canada and controlled the United States. Would we think it was an act of terrorism to support resistance forces in Canada or to resistance forces in Mexico? And wouldn't we feel threatened? And wouldn't we be doing everything that we could to kick Iran out of North America, right?
Yeah.
Iran is meddling in North America, right? And it's so ironic that we say, well, Iran is meddling in the Middle East. Well, you know, newsflash, Iran is in the Middle East, right?
Country.
The United States is not a part of the Middle East, but we've made ourselves a presence through this particular history. Now, the other very important issue, I think, and I'm sorry to be dominating the conversation so much.
This is great. We need this.
But I think really the most critical thing for the current crisis, I'm always reminded of Noam Chomsky, who was asked, you know, several years in advance to give a talk, and what would the title would he use? And he said, well, how about the current crisis in the Middle East? Because there's always some crisis.
He wouldn't have any trouble.
So the current crisis in the Middle East really stems from when the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear weapons deal that the Obama administration had very painstakingly and carefully crafted. And this was a monumental achievement. John Kerry as Secretary of State and Barack Obama and the State Department at that time, they did a tremendous job. And we talked about this back in May of 2018. We devoted an entire show to looking at the, what was it, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it was called, sometimes referred to as the P5+1. Because, and that's important, because it meant that Russia and China and Germany and France and Great Britain were also involved in this and the signatories to this agreement. So the major allies, the major powers in the world all basically said, we think it's a good thing that Iran, the theocratic regime in Iran, which we don't trust, that they not seek a nuclear weapon. And so let's negotiate something, and they did. They negotiated a very strong agreement. It put inspectors in, it allowed for inspections, it allowed for all kinds of verification. It was actually a very strong agreement. And then Donald Trump comes into office, and if anything guides Donald Trump, I mean, mostly this is incoherent recklessness on the part of this administration. I mean, he's ignorant, he does not understand the world. He has no foreign policy. It's all incoherent. It's mostly all about him. And of course, one of the guiding principles, if he has any, is if Barack Obama did it, I have to undo it. If Barack Obama did this, I have to destroy it, no matter what the consequences are. And it's just personal to him. I mean, it goes against the national security interests of the United States to do many of the things that he does. But it's out of this personal animosity toward Obama that he feels he has to destroy everything that Obama accomplished. And so he started to criticize the JCPOA from the very beginning during the campaign. And once he got elected, he decided to take us out of that, which is what occasioned our show back in May of 2018 when Trump withdrew. Now again, John Kerry, I saw John Kerry being interviewed by Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC the other night, and Kerry's just livid about everything concerning this, but he went through in great detail all the things that agreement actually did, countering all the Trump propaganda and lies and deceptions about it. And one of the big things is, we gave Iran all this money.
Please, let's clear up this myth, especially as the alternative view here. The thing that is reported in the media is how we gave, you know, name your number now, right? Trump always likes to escalate the number. In one speech, it's 50 billion. Now it's 150 billion, right? The deal was to lift some of the sanctions, right? So if you're going to cooperate, here's something. And those were held stranded assets from Iran from way back in this history. That's
was
why it's so
Iran's
important
money.
it's their money that's been locked up, given all these other agreements for all these years, that then you now have access to, right? So when people think of, oh, we paid Iran to like sign this deal, no, we gave you access back to money that was sitting there since some of this from the 70s at minimum, that then you use to get back your oil fields, to do your own infrastructure, to pay back debts.
Right.
Huge it's not like there was just a gimme, and I think that's one of the worst things that I see falsely reported in the media right now.
Right. I mean, he explicitly said it. Trump said that the other day. This was because the Obama administration gave them the money and enabled them to buy these rockets and to do these things. A direct result.
And that's just a lie.
Just an
outright lie.
Close to true.
And so, so destroying this agreement and then lying about it, and again, all because it was created by the Obama administration, was just a horrible, horrible blunder. I mean, if we want to talk about one of the greatest foreign policy blunders, here you've got an agreement which prevents Iran from seeking a nuclear weapon. And the rest of the major powers in the world are on board with this and support this, and still support it, even after Trump has taken the United States out of it. What a colossal blunder this is. And of course it opens the door now for Iran to pursue a nuclear weapon, and it initiates then the Trump administration's extreme pressure campaign on Iran. And guess where that leads us, right? That leads us to the tit for tat, the back and forth that then results in the assassination of Soleimani the other day, and the initiation of the current crisis. Now, there are many people who have been advocating for war against Iran for a very long time, going back to 1979. One of the strongest is John Bolton. I think we need to mention that. John Bolton has been a cheerleader for taking out Iran for as long as possible. How to prevent Iran from getting a bomb? Bomb Iran. That was the headline in the New York Times. John Bolton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and said, bomb Iran. And of course, the other major person who has been pushing for bombing Iran is Pompeo. Our Secretary of State, who's supposed to be engaged in diplomacy, right? And is now an advocate, a cheerleader. And he's the main force within the Trump administration right now, pushing for this. So we're in very dangerous times. And so let's focus on the assassination now. How did they justify taking out an official? I mean, let's be honest. The Obama administration engaged in a lot of targeted killings, right? Which we have spoken out against and opposed. But the Obama administration, at least when they undertook this campaign of targeted killings, they were aiming at what they called non-state actors and involved in different terrorist groups. Now, again, I still think that this is immoral and illegal to do this. It's still killing killing people without legal authorization to do so. But at least there is a difference between those kind of targeted killings and actually going after a head of state or a high government official within a state, which is what we did in this particular case.
I mean, again, the first question is this a state actor? We do have rules, not just in our country, but at the UN and at international war, how we conduct these things. So whether a person is actually representing that government, it becomes a really different legal question. So, and this is to the point too of this retaliation. So we should be calling this an assassination. This is breaking every legal rule we've ever had about war, not in this country, but around the world. When you assassinate someone, what kind of expectations for retaliation might you have after you perform that kind? So I think that is getting really missed. And okay, fine, he was a bad guy. So are we. Would you then, like I think your thought experiment about if this was the U.S. and this had happened to us and they were surrounding you and then they took out, one of our generals.
They took out General Petraeus during, at some point when he was.
How would you expect someone to respond to an actual assassination, right? So I think that is an important point, right? So question number one is this a state actor, a government agent? We need to call it what it is then, since all of that seems clear. And point two is it an imminent threat, right? That's the other sort of, and that has international law and sort of things with our Congress that we can talk about later. So,
Well, international law is very clear. I mean, the United States Charter in Article 2, Section 4, says states cannot use military force in their international relations. Boom. Now, there's two exceptions.
That's right.
Two exceptions. One exception is if it's authorized by the UN Security Council.
Yep.
Obviously, there was
We
no
didn't go there.
authorization.
Nothing.
And we would be rejected, just as we were rejected trying to get an authorization to invade Iraq
That's
back
right.
in 2002. So that didn't happen. Now, the other thing is self-defense. Now,
Right.
you have to be under direct attack. If you're under direct attack, you can respond, you can defend yourself. But even then, only until the UN Security Council
That's
has
right.
a chance to get together and decide how to respond. Now, in this case, they were talking about a kind of anticipatory
That's right.
self-defense, right? That there was an imminent threat that they had to respond to. And this is covered under international law.
Yep.
The international
Sure is.
law standard for whether you can engage in this kind of a response to an imminent threat is very clear. It's spelled out. It goes way back to a longstanding case, the Caroline case. It says that the threat has to be instant, overwhelming, leave no choice of means, and no moment for deliberation.
None.
Boom.
I don't
4 strikes and you're out.
That's right.
Yeah.
None of that applied. None of that applied whatsoever.
Right.
And in fact, there's even some reporting that what Soleimani was really doing, he was coming back, he had was going to brief the Iraqi government about a diplomatic initiative
That's
to
right.
reduce tensions with Saudi Arabia. And so that actually, far from being there to carry out
Right.
an attack against Americans, he was on a diplomatic mission, according to some
The Iraqi
journalists.
president, I think.
The
said
Iraqi
that.
president himself said
Yeah.
that. Yeah, the prime minister
Yeah.
said that was what the purpose of the mission was. Now, even if, and there's no doubt Soleimani had been involved with a number of other proxy groups throughout the Middle East, Hezbollah and Hamas and others, and there's no doubt he probably has been responsible for carrying out certain kinds of attacks. Any attack that invokes violence is illegal under international law and immoral from our perspective, and we condemn it.
Right.
But again, it's not like Soleimani was coming to the United States to attack people here. He was attacking those forces that are ringing and encircling his own country
Yeah.
in an effort to
Yeah.
try to drive them out. And but clearly there was no imminent threat.
Right.
If we felt okay, if we wanted to say Soleimani is a bad actor, he's done this, that, and the other thing, what we could do, of course, is go to the Security Council.
That's right.
And say, hey, look.
Right.
Iran is doing these bad things,
That's
right?
right.
Here's what Iran's doing, and these are illegal under international law, and what are we going to do about
That's
it as
right,
an
yeah.
international community, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, we had done something about it under the international community, right?
Right.
That
The
was the
P5
treaty.
plus one.
Exactly.
We had
Yeah.
a joint comprehensive
Yeah.
plan of action.
Yeah.
We could have addressed these things.
That's exactly right.
And these kind of things probably
Yeah.
wouldn't have been happening or continued to
Yeah.
happen after the Obama administration negotiated that treaty.
Yeah.
But we didn't do that, right? We didn't go that route.
It does
Instead,
really
we carry
yeah.
out an illegal assassination.
Yeah, it does really show this progression, right? So thanks for reminding us too of the Iraq War and Cheney and Powell and going and trying to, at least we used to, even if you think that was a sham,
Yeah.
right? And you think that we were going to do what we're going to do anyways, we were still respecting some norm and some legal international standards of law by going and doing those things.
Colin
right?
Powell at least went to the
At
United
least
Nations.
went and did that.
Now, mostly what he said was untrue.
Yes,
right?
that's what I'm
And,
saying. I mean, if you
Yes,
think
yes.
that was, you know,
And there's the famous story about, Cheney kept sending over,
That's
the vice
right.
president kept sending over all these talking points that he wanted Colin Powell to present, because
Yes.
Colin Powell was
Yes.
this huge respected figure, and he
Yes.
could help seal the deal
Yes.
at the UN. And Powell kept, I'm not reading
not
that
reading
BS,
that one.
I'm not reading that BS. He kept throwing things on the
right.
floor,
Yeah.
apparently.
That's right.
And
according-
Wilkinson was in the
That's right.
room. with
Lawrence
that,
Wilkerson is
Right.
the source of that story, I think.
right, the erosion of the U.S., not a recognition of our historical responsibility, but then just complete erosion of our accountability
Yeah.
within the international regime, right? So 20 years ago, we're willing to at least go and, maybe cover it up a little and do these other things. Now we're not even going to
Yeah.
go. We're
Yeah.
just going to...
We're not even faking it.
No, we're not even faking it. Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, we committed international crimes
Yes.
in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we lied about it in the attempt to
Yes.
get support, but we're not even pretending
No.
and along those lines anymore. We did it, and
Right.
we come up with this phony imminent
Right.
threat idea, for which they then present absolutely no evidence.
Right.
That's right.
None.
And they briefed the Congress the other day about it, and even several Republicans were extremely angry, right,
Yeah,
Don?
Senator Lee and a couple other people, they just said, this told us nothing. They didn't advance one credible argument that justified what they did. And these were Republicans saying
Presented
that.
no evidence
Right.
that this was an imminent threat. And so there's that huge international law component, which
That's right.
we've just talked about. And so I want people to understand that. Oh, by the way, one other element of that.
Yeah.
When Trump said, "Oh, if they retaliate, I'm going to bomb 52 sites
Oh,
in
yeah,
Iran,
right.
and some of them will
Cultural
be
sites. Yeah.
cultural sites," which a very clear, explicitly
Yes.
clear violation of international law.
What I thought was interesting about that was Pompeo, after they showed that on the news, Pompeo said he didn't say anything about cultural. I mean, who are you going to believe, your eyes or me? I
That's
mean,
exactly right.
that's where we are.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. Yeah.
There's
but-
a couple of points that seem interesting to me is, you were mentioning, who's in the room when
Yeah.
you get to make these decisions, and when you've got a couple of true hawks,
Oh, right,
like
exactly.
a Pompeo and a Bolton. So even if that is Trump's instinct, right, and who's in the room to make that, because we know that this has come before W, that these kinds of things came before Obama,
Sure.
right, and
Yeah.
just that, because of the retaliation factors, because of international law, respect some of that.
Yeah.
The answer
Yes.
was no. We know that this very same person, Soleimani, has come up in historic. So I think that's really telling about this administration and sort of where we are.
Who's
And
he surround himself with? Yeah.
exactly. And the second thing is, there's been some reporting that, well, why would Trump do this, just other than him being crazy and lacking any foreign policy understanding, is to try to avoid a sort of Hillary Clinton Benghazi type situation, right? So think about how he utilized Benghazi and the attacks on the embassy there and their handling of that. And if any Americans were to get killed on his watch, right, he would have to go through that. And that is there's some report that says that's what pushed this whole conversation over the edge, that no way do I want to have to answer that. So therefore it's an imminent threat. And so therefore we must go in. Because why? The motivation for Trump is to save your political skin.
That's it.
Has nothing to do with actual law or history or purpose.
No, international law is.
vital interest of the United States.
When I saw that report, I thought that makes the most sense to me, actually. When does he behave? We know that political lens is a big trigger for him.
Sure.
He's
Sure.
very impulsive.
Yep.
Erratic.
And again, I like that term, incoherent recklessness. So
Yeah.
somebody in the Washington Post used that term the other day. By the way, there was
Yeah.
also a report in the New York Times that when the people that were presenting Trump with some options
Yes.
about what to do with Iran and the recent skirmishes that had taken place,
Yeah.
the embassy thing and all of that, that they included assassinating Soleimani just because they thought, oh, if we give him this most extreme thing, the rest of the things that we're suggesting will
Doesn't-
seem
yeah.
reasonable in comparison to this extreme reckless act. But of course, what does he do?
He
He takes the most extreme, impulsive, reckless act to do. So
yeah.
now, I also think in terms of the legal issue,
Yes.
one final thing on the international law, the UN rapporteur on extrajudicial execution. So this is a high UN official who's supposed to focus on these targeted killings and these assassinations, these extrajudicial actions. And she has come out and said that this is very likely to be a violation of international law to do this. She want to do a little bit more investigation, but there doesn't appear to be any justification for that.
Yeah.
So the international legal issues, I think, are pretty clear. We
Yeah.
definitely have violated them, right?
Yeah.
We're definitely involved in some state crimes here. Now, the domestic issues, I think, are
Yes.
important. Denise, what's the
my-
Constitution say
So
about all this?
exactly. So this is not just a foreign policy crisis. This is yet another crisis here for our own institutions and our own Constitution. So, all right, Article 2 should give Congress the power to declare war,
Right.
and that is that's what the Constitution says. So it's a really interesting history there, and you guys know most of this as well with the War Powers Act, right? So this understanding that there might be some executive action, right? And we've toyed with this. What is the line between congressional and executive power on things like sending troops or CIAs and all of these things that are done through executive power, so that the Congress and the American public doesn't have to know about those things or doesn't have to approve them? And what's the line between those kinds of excursions, right? We've named them different things over the years. Conflicts and war. And Vietnam, of course, is the ultimate ongoing conflict that tries to walk that line, and Congress finally asserts itself with the War Powers Act in 1973 and says, Article 2, that's our business, and if you're really going to continue this ongoing escalation of conflict, then you're going to need our approval for that, right? And so the War Powers Act tries to take some of that back into Congress, and I always think it's important to remember, in part, what ends the Vietnam War is that Congress finally also uses its power of the purse and stops funding. If you're going to keep doing this, we're just not going to give you any money for it, right? So we are in another, 1973, right? The House yesterday then voted to add Iran and to say this conflict is the War Powers Act, and to write this resolution that passes the House. Now, the interesting thing about the War Powers Act, because it is meant for when an executive is riding their power too much and enabling us to conflicts. It's written so that if it passes with a concurrent resolution, so just the House, the president doesn't have to sign this, right? Because the whole point is that you've got a president who is out of control. So if the Senate were to pass a concurrent resolution, you could then bring an end to this type of conflict, right? Now, that's not ultimately what did it in Vietnam. It may not be ultimately what does this for Iran, but at least it's a start at Congress trying to reassert its constitutional powers and check this president.
So the resolution that was introduced in the House was non-binding, right?
Yes.
But Senator Kane's resolution that he introduced in the Senate was binding, right? But it has no chance of getting through because of the intransigent. You think?
I mean, you got Mike Lee, you got Rand Paul.
Yes.
What are some of the vulnerable Republican, like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski?
And maybe Romney.
If you get, 7 or 8?
Yeah, I mean, you don't
that
need...
would be wonderful.
Got a resolution.
That's true.
Right.
That would be... And that would be binding, huh?
Yes.
And Trump wouldn't have to sign it or anything like that.
No. So it doesn't have to go, again, the whole point here with the War Powers Act is executive branch has superseded Congress's authority to declare war.
And so what they're relying on is the resolution that came after 9/11, which basically said that President Bush could do whatever he thinks is necessary.
In the interest of national security. These briefings then have taken on this shadow of, but if we told you, you would then have information that our enemies would be able to...
If we tell you why we did it, we'd have to kill you.
Basically, right? This is the logic that we now live in, right?
Yeah, they're trying to use the authorization for use of military force, which was passed first in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, and then another version of it was passed to authorize attacking Iraq, at least domestically. It was some weak attempt to provide congressional support for what the president and the Bush administration had already decided to do. And again, the larger context here is that after World War II, when the United States, when the full-blown U.S.-American empire emerges, right, the national security state and the effort to intervene around the world, leading to the 1953 overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran and a whole bunch of other places, in Vietnam eventually. In that context, the balance of power shifted away from the Congress to the president, to the executive branch. And so the executive branch has been usurping power ever since then, and it's Republican presidents do it, Democratic presidents do it, and it ratchets up. Once you cede that power, then it's hard to get it back. And Congress has almost completely abdicated its power. The Constitution is very clear. The Congress is the one that declares war. The president only becomes the commander-in-chief once the Congress decides to go to war. Article 2, Section 2 says the president becomes commander-in-chief
Yep.
when called into the service
That's right.
of the United States.
That's right.
Who calls him into service?
Congress.
The Congress, right? But Congress has almost completely abdicated this power, and they've ceded this power to the executive branch in many, many ways and over many, many years. From the Gulf of Tonkin resolution,
That's right.
Yeah. Right.
yeah, you know, this authorization to use
Yes.
military force. They tried to grab some of it back in '73 from Nixon with the War Powers Act, which
Right.
you've gone over, Denise. And most of these have been feeble efforts.
That's right.
Right now, we're basically in a situation where one person gets to decide whether we go to war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One person. And right now, that one person is Donald Trump, the
right.
most impulsive, reckless,
right.
ignorant president that we've ever had. And he's the guy who gets to decide whether we go to war.
Right.
That's scary. So, yeah. One of the things that really strikes me is the univocal voice of the Republicans. The refusal to, I mean, there's a couple of exceptions to that, but not in the House. That I think there were three
Republicans
in the House
Yeah,
that stood. But there's so much fear of stepping out of line.
That's right.
And what the consequences are. So that the whole question of a reasonable debate about this is off the table.
Yeah.
Which is tremendous.
Well, we're back to that Trump base again,
That's
which
right.
you know, Trump probably correctly feels is going to support whatever he does. That he has
Yeah,
painted
that's
Iran
right.
as the evil enemy, and anything Iran does, we have to respond to. And again, there's
Right.
no notion of this history, none of this legal analysis. Some of you know the conservative columnist Cal Thomas.
Yes.
All right, so I read his column the other day, just because he's writing about Iran. I figured, okay, I got to see what he says,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
How much of the history does he cover? Absolutely none.
Right.
Right. None of what we talked about in the first half of the show. He mentions not a single word of any of that.
Yeah.
The Iranians are evil, and we have to respond to evil. And Obama didn't do it. He doesn't even mention the nuclear weapons
yeah.
deal. That's completely absent from his column as well. It's
Yeah.
just that here are the Iranians. They're evil. We have to respond to evil.
Right.
Obama didn't do it. Trump is going to stand up to evil, and
Yeah.
so cheer him on. And that's the kind of and that's the base.
That's right.
That's how Trump's base sees this, and basically that's how the media has often.
Yep.
I mean, it's not just conservative columnists like Cal Thomas.
Yep.
I mean, I think even the more mainstream media is also at fault here for how they've portrayed this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is some going to be a rift in the Trump base over this issue, though. So there's sort of two camps, right? There's the tough guy camp, right? This is being a tough guy and got to go get him and retaliate and show strength, right? Attack, 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 and that's
Right.
how you stay strong. And I think there's absolutely some support within the Trump base for that. The Navy SEAL Gallagher that we
Yeah,
get,
Gallagher,
that is
yeah.
sort of embodies the tough guy. And you saw Trump supporters making fake pictures of Soleimani and posting them, right? These are the kind of things that we have laws about that you don't that's what Gallagher was accused of posting pictures with corpses,
Yeah.
right? You don't glorify your kills, right? And so there's that I think has some support. But remember, Trump ran on an anti-war that also mobilized a huge amount of the Rust Belt base and the
That's
folks
true.
who are going to go fight these wars. He ran a no war campaign. Remember, right? If Obama does this, it's just to get reelected. A wag the dog strategy might be at play here. But I think there are a lot of folks, and so I do think there's a bit more of a chance that some of the Republicans might not want to support this war because it's hugely unpopular, of
Yes,
course.
yeah.
So I would
Yeah,
look
that's
to
true.
see if there is some split in how the base deals with, do we want the tough guy or do we want the guy that said he would get us out of this 20-year ongoing conflict?
I think among young people,
Yeah.
especially, who will be charged to run there. I had a student in my class yesterday who was in ROTC. I said,
Yeah.
"Oh, what do you
Oh,
think of the military?" She
gosh.
says, "I'm not going." So, I mean, I think that feeling is out there, especially among young people.
Yep.
They're saying, "What are we going there for? You going to send me over there for what?"
Yeah.
Nah, I don't think so.
This is part of Trump's incoherence, right?
It is.
Because he has spoken out about these
That's right.
wars. That he criticized the Iraq War and said we shouldn't be
Right.
meddling over there, and we need to bring our troops home. And
Right.
of course, what has he done? He sent more troops
That's
over
right.
there, and then he takes this impulsive action to strike out at the Iranian major general.
Yeah.
And so again, it's just this sort of incoherence. I mean,
That's
he's
right.
just all over the map, and
That's right.
it just whatever suits Donald
Yeah.
Trump at the particular moment, right?
Yeah. You know, the other thing that's sort of interesting is the foreign press. So, you know, in America, Trump's able to get away with this story, and maybe with the Republicans, oh, Soleimani was a bad guy, and the Iranians are evil, so we can just start like yesterday with history and pretend that that's the case. But the Soviet and Chinese press both counteract that truth in the international world, and we'll talk about, hey, we were in this deal that was making us safer, that we kind of wanted the U.S. to be, you know, lead on, and we need that, and they're speaking out about some of these things. So I think that's an interesting take as well, that version of the truth from the Trump world isn't translating to those folks, right? And so what does Trump do with Russia, right? If there are, of course, those ties and all these other things going on, and the Soviets are like, yeah, maybe not so much, that we like your activities here, and they're reporting different press.
That's interesting.
That I'm not sure where that goes, but it's something to look at, I think.
I think, Ron, you mentioned earlier about the Democratic response. I've been very impressed with Bernie Sanders' response. I thought it's very reasonable. He's talking about international diplomacy. He's talking about the futility of a military solution to this whole thing, the need to engage with other nations. And I think people, they challenge him on that and say, okay, so now what are you going to do? As if there was an immediate answer. There's a history here.
Right.
This is not an easy way out. There's not, tomorrow we're going to settle this. But we have to begin. We have to begin in a whole different direction than we're going. The response of the whole Trump administration has been, we're tougher than them.
Right.
We got more guns and weapons than them, and that's going to lead nowhere. That's going to lead nowhere.
We got the best weapons. We got the best.
Yeah, we got the best, and we're the toughest.
Right.
And that's going to just escalate this whole thing and make it crazy.
Because there's no doubt the Middle East is still a vastly complicated and critical, dangerous area. I mean, not only do you have the Israeli-Palestinian issues, you've got Saudi Arabia's actions. And Bernie was on Stephen Colbert last night and had some very harsh words for Saudi Arabia. But again, when pressed, what would you do as president? Well, negotiate. That's the first thing you do. Get people together and negotiate, right? War, and Bernie was pressed. I mean, Colbert pressed him a little bit. Well, you know, would you ever use a military force? And he says, well, sometimes you may have to use military force, but it has to always be the last option.
That's right.
The
It's not
absolute
the
last
first
option.
thing.
It's not the first option. It's
Exactly.
always the very, very, very last thing that you
That's
do
right.
if you're forced into it. And there's so many other ways we could act to avoid getting into that situation. Oil is still central. Michael Clare had a great column on TomDispatch.com this week. Says you can't forget about oil. Iran has tremendous oil assets. You can't forget about the importance of oil and all the what happens in the Middle East. There's lots of complicated issues there, but at the center, historically and still to this day, is the issue of oil.
Absolutely.
And it's not just that the United States needs to have access to that oil for our own domestic purposes, right? With the fracking revolution and other technological changes, we are doing pretty well in terms of our sufficiency at this point. But who controls that oil controls the world, right?
Yeah.
It's the geopolitical advantage that controlling the oil of the Middle East, and of course Iran could strangle the world's access to the oil, right? Because of the Straits of Hormuz. They're right there, and they can control that and block that. And so there's the geopolitical significance of oil to all of this involvement in the Middle East.
So the cardinal rule of organizing is never get isolated.
Yes.
And we continually, the Trump administration continually isolates ourselves. And that just makes it practically impossible to solve this situation.
That's right. Well, and that's the other reason that the only political hope that we might see for some de-escalation here is the economics of this, right? Stocks
Right.
tanking, right? Because war. Now, oil, of course, saw its so cui bono. We always have to also ask who benefits,
right.
from such an action, right? And who loses. The oil price spikes. It's still lower than it probably ever has been, given these types of conflicts, right? So. One way out of war, and are we still gonna have to care about the Straits of Hormuz, right? If we actually did switch to, I don't see a lot of wars over solar. Let me put it that way. I mean, I suppose you could build a wall that shaded me, and we might have a conflict.
Don't give him ideas. Don't give him ideas.
But a lot of this, I think, has to do with, of course, the economics of that. That's a huge amount of money that's sitting in the ground underneath Saudi, and that's what we're continuing to protect, and that's what we continue to see as our primary interest, and it's not. And we have other ways out of that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. In fact, from a climate change perspective, it's got to stay there. It's got to stay in
Let
the
it
ground.
go.
Right.
Stranded assets.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did our oil get under their skin in the first place?
I still remember that.
But it's got to stay there, right? It's got to stay there.
It's kind of like why'd they build the country next to our bases, right?
Yeah. Why did they locate their country right next to our bases?
What were those good folks thinking?
Well, so the United States, I mean, obviously we're involved in the Middle East, and that's not going to, that can't be walked back at this point. We're such a huge presence there historically, but what particular role do we play, right? I think that's, and that's where I think the Obama administration, by negotiating the nuclear weapons agreement, was attempting to say, look, the United States can play a different role in this region. We can play a more positive role. Our role has primarily been negative over the years, violent and negative and illegal under international law, but we can play a different role, and started to take us in that direction. And that was an important step, and it wasn't enough, but it started to move us in a different direction. And now Trump, with his recklessness and impulsive actions, has blown that up and has taken us in a completely different direction. Is this a wag the dog thing for Trump? Impeachment is looming?
That's why I think his split personality is showing on this issue. Is there enough wag the dog that gets the tough guy voters, and is the distraction from impeachment, and how long can that last, and with the economy tanking and the rest of your base who doesn't want to go to war because it is those young people? I think there's going to be I hope that there's going to be a conflict among those base voters. Maybe this might be the thing that breaks that bottleneck of 41%, no matter what day or what is happening. But it absolutely has taken the steam out of impeachment. Right? I mean, if you want to overtake the news cycle, here's one way to do it.
There was a spontaneous reaction on the streets, which I thought was very encouraging. You were out there on Sunday, about 75 people right off the bat on the streets in Kalamazoo and in cities all over the country, people saying no war. So, I mean, I think that as things become clearer, as other voices are heard, that there will be a mobilization to oppose this thing. And I think you're right, that really could erode his base. I think so.
And what role is this going to play in the 2020 Democratic primaries role? I think that's a critical question. You've talked about Bernie Sanders. I think Bernie's the strongest candidate out there talking about these issues in a way that makes sense. What about the other candidates? Almost every Democratic candidate had to, talk about how bad Soleimani was, what an evil monster he was, before they could then make any kind of criticisms about the recklessness of the Trump move. But the Democratic Party's got to decide what it wants to do here. I mean, we have to point out that the Democratic Party, in overwhelming numbers, decided to support the National Defense Authorization Act, which provides, 700, almost $800 billion to the Pentagon. And that was a huge 377 to 48 vote in December. There were 2 amendments in that authorization, one to block funding for a war where they're in, and another one to repeal the authorization for use of military force in Iraq. Both of those were stripped out of there because the Democrats didn't, the leadership didn't want them in there, didn't want to raise those issues. So the Democratic Party's got to make some decisions here too. What direction do they want to go? They can't have it both ways. They can't criticize Trump for doing some of these reckless, impulsive things and then turn around and give the Pentagon a blank check.
The power of the purse, as I understand history, is one of the major reasons the Vietnam War ended. And this is another thing that Congress could take back. And I think you're absolutely right. We're going to have to look at every Democratic presidential nominee's record on these things. And Bernie might have a very similar Obama story here, of being able to, in some of those cases, if I'm correct, being able to say he's the only one that's voted no for some of these things historically, right? Which is something that helped Barack Obama in an age when, gosh, we've been doing this war, we don't want to do this.
Right.
What can you run on? When you think about it that way, that I think will be a very attractive thing for some Democrats.
And I think Bernie's introduced a resolution, joint resolution that bans money for any war with Iran. What chance does that have to get through the Congress? But nonetheless, he's taken the stand, put that out there as an issue.
That's right.
We just have a couple of minutes left, Denise, and I want to bring us back to the connection between possibility of war with Iran, what's happening in the Middle East with the climate disaster. We've talked about it to some extent, the fact that oil has to stay in the ground. But more generally, how do you see the interrelationship between peace in the Middle East and climate justice and
I mean, here's another example. We've talked about the Green New Deal on this show. Here's just another example of the true threat to our security is being able to meet our needs and inequality. And when we deal with those things, we deal with climate and we deal with war. So these things are inextricably linked. There's no way we can address one without the other.
And if we would go to war with Iran, just think of the environmental catastrophe it is.
What did Saddam do? If you want this oil so bad, we'll just start burning it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we could see some situations like that again.
And already the Pentagon is the primary organizational offender when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions.
That's right.
And that would only dramatically increase if we ended up going to war here.
That's right.
Michael Clare, by the way, also has a new book out talking about the Pentagon's issues and relationships with climate change, so we'll have to come back and revisit that topic. Denise, we just have a minute left. What's going on with Fridays for the Future and the Climate Crisis Coalition here in Kalamazoo?
So much. So first I would iterate Don's point and several of the folks that work on the show. A big, huge shout out to Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War for putting together all of the protests here in town and marches tomorrow, I believe. So you can find allies in this community to protest this war. And so a huge shout out to all of those. I'm missing the first Fridays for Future by being here with you guys. I'm going to talk about Iran and oil. So the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition continues to go strong. Every Friday at noon, most of them are on Western Michigan University's campus back at Fetzer Center. Come join us.
Free parking.
Free parking, that's right. We paid the big bucks so we could get free parking this time. The climate emergencies are moving forward, so we hope to be getting our hands a little bit into the weeds with actual climate action planning in the next little bit.
Sounds good. So lots of things happening.
Lots of things happening.
All right, well, we're out of time for today. Thank you, Denise Keele. Thank you, Don Cooney. Thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. We hope you come back and see us again.